our assignment, I'm going to be very brief here. Our assignment is to, in the program, how the land, or talk about how the land has operated in the context of a much larger movement. And I interpret that, all of us here interpret that as all the things that Wes forgot to talk about over 40 years. And my assignment is to keep order with this unruly crowd to my right. And to do that, I need partly a volunteer. All these guys will talk until the cows come home, so to speak. And I need a timekeeper, and the qualifications for a good timekeeper are somebody who's big and mean, a Trump voter, and can threaten effectively, so it's got to be one of you. You're going to do it? Okay, all right. At 6 minutes, you warn them. At 7 minutes, you stand up and like that. Now, we're going to proceed from your right to the left. And I think that's, in a political time, that's a good thing to do. So we're going to let Fred wrap this up. I'll say a few things afterwards also. I'm going to go last just to correct the errors that will accumulate when you put 5 old white guys on the podium. If we encroach on, who's next in the program? Is it Wendell's on the program? That's right. Now, if we encroach on Wendell's time, we all know he's just going to get up and read some darn poem again. We've been asking Wendell for years for just data. Wendell, just give us numbers. Now, I'm going to just say one word. Gary Nabhan needs no introduction, ethnobotanist. Years ago wrote such a striking book, The Desert Smells Like Rain, and has followed that with lots more of really brilliant thinking. Fred Kirschenmann at the end will wrap up the panel, and then I'll say a few things just to, well, I'm not sure what I'll do. I'll say a few things. And Fred is at the Stone Barn and also the Leopold Center. Ron Kroese has been around the Sustainable Ag movement for really since its inception, and also has done a tour of duty with the McKnight Foundation and knows philanthropy. Jeff Filipiak was the guy last night who cheered when Peter Buffett said something about Milwaukee. And I promised to mispronounce his name, and I blew that. So these are all Renaissance men, 7 minutes per person, and we'd like to open up the floor for Q&A afterwards. So let's start with Gary Nabhan.
Greetings, Earthlings. Let us now praise ecospherian contrarians, and in particular, one contrarian from Kansas who was a contrarian before being a contrarian was cool, and that's Wes. And I think Wes took Wendell's poems about the mad farmer just too seriously over the years, and everyone else up here has been vying to be mad in their own bioregion too. What struck me coming from the stinking hot desert in Arizona is that what Wes's vision was about is far more than whether a single herbaceous perennial crop makes it onto our tables. It's what I think the gift that he's given all of us from any region is this idea of using nature as a measure to design perennial polycultures that keep the soil and what we now know as the soil microbiome in place and thriving, as well as our cultures thriving. And I would say that Wes has hybridized something that has kept perennial polycultures from becoming industrial polycultures, and that's hybridizing the idea of using perennial polycultures in the context of those two wonderful phrases, meeting the expectations of the land, that I believe is from Thoreau, and consulting the genius of the place. And so what I've always been struck by is that the vision is not just about a successful polyculture for the tallgrass prairie, although the crowning achievement so far has been that, but how it inspires all of us from other bioregions. And how many people in this room are from bioregions other than the prairie biome? All of us have an obligation to take what Wes has put out for us seriously in how it plays out with the mix of native plants, soil or microorganisms, and wildlife in our own region. And let me give you two examples very, very quickly. I just came back from an incredible meeting in southern Mexico that I was telling Ricardo Salvador about, because some of his distant kin were the major players there, where over 800 ethnobiologists and agroecologists got together in Mérida, and what they were talking about is how to use the tropical rainforest ecosystem as a model, as our ancestors have done, of viable agroforestry systems, some of which that still exist have 40 to 70 tree species as well as many other perennials underneath them per hectare. They keep the soil in place, they provide an incredible variety of foods, fibers, medicines, everything, in a way that mimics the tropical rainforest structure, function, and composition there. And while we've been talking about that we're drawing on for inspiration 2 million years of evolution of the vegetation types and communities on this continent, let us not forget that we have 50,000 years of human intelligence in looking at natural systems, and 10,000 years not just of deviating from these perennial systems, but many indigenous people did use those systems as models for their own kind of agriculture. And there are still about 300 million indigenous and traditional peoples that make their livelihoods and eat largely from agroforestry systems that mimic the landscapes in which they live. So this is not something of the past. It's not done with. People are still living off this. 300 million people is the best guess of folks that are still living off perennial agricultural systems in this world. And we need to pay attention to them because, as my friend Victor Toledo said, these indigenous and traditional peoples are the memory, the cultural memory of our species. In the desert where I live, about the time that Wes and Marty and others got started with the prairie model here, we were looking at the model in the Sonoran Desert of 7 different whole life forms, cacti and tree legumes and understory herbaceous perennials in what we call nurse plant guilds. And we started to take crops from there to check for their agronomic qualities and taste qualities. This is about 1976 to when Meeting the Expectations of the Land came out in the early 80s. And 5 of the 6 of our top candidates are now in cultivation and in restaurants every day of the year in the Sonoran Desert region. Half of those, or 2/3 of those, are perennials. Others are understory crops, wild chilies and things like that. The only time I ever saw Wes speechless for more than 2 minutes was when I gave him a handful of wild chilies and he didn't know what they were. And the shock on his Kansas system lasted 2 minutes, and then he started talking again. But the point is that Wes's vision is more than just what happens here in the prairie. It will restructure and redesign agriculture and agricultural communities everywhere around the world. And I think the missing link that we didn't know about then, that Fred and I were talking about last night, is this attention to the soil microbiome and the diversity there that we had no vocabulary to even use 20 years ago. So blessings to all of you that are doing this work wherever you live. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. That was inspiring as usual. My name's Ron Kroese, and I get to talk a little bit about the work that I've been somewhat involved with, and last 10 years fortunate enough to help to convince some folks with funds at the McKnight Foundation in Minnesota to get behind these efforts. And we're talking about the context within the Land Institute has played such a major role over the last 40 years. And part of that context is inspiring a lot of good hard work in Washington, D.C. and in states around the country to actually bring about more sustainable agriculture policies in the United States. And I want to talk about some of those policies today, but first to give a little context, I was, in 1982, I co-founded a group in Minnesota called the Land Stewardship Project, and I'm happy thank you, and I'm happy to say that we were talking about founder syndrome these days, you know, and one of the things that happened with that after my 11 years, the organization I left and the organization only got stronger and better, so that's what I hope for this one too. But one of the blessings was that both Wendell Berry, through his writing and his guidance, and Wes Jackson and a guy named Marty Strange from the Center for Rural Affairs were mentors to me, and one more man that I owe so much to, and also to Dana Jackson, by the way, who after she left here went to work for the Land Stewardship Project, and did a lot of really good work, including policy work at both the state and federal level. But my other mentor was, I got to work for Farmers Union after I did a stint in the 70s for a good prairie populist Democrat named Jim Aberesk from South Dakota, was a man named Victor Ray. What a wonderful name. He lived up to his name, who was the director of education programs at National Farmers Union. And he guided my work for several years on our board at the Land Stewardship Project. So what was happening in those years, not only in Minnesota, but throughout the Great Plains, where several groups were popping up to really promote an agriculture that we said that we hoped it would become economically viable, environmentally sustainable, humane, and socially just. And that became sort of the guiding force for our work. And these groups, some of them are represented here. I mentioned the Center for Rural Affairs already. The Kansas Rural Center is Mary Fund here. At least 35 years, something like that. She's been working at it. The Northern Plains Sustainable Agriculture Society. I don't know if Fred's going to talk about it, but Fred was one of the founders of that group. The Illinois Stewardship Alliance, the Wisconsin Rural Development Center, there's several more. And in 1987, a lot of us came together, really aware of what was then called the farm crisis, the fact that more and more farms were being driven off their farms, coupled with the fact that there was increasing evidence of all the degradation of the industrial agriculture system. We came together and formed what we called the Sustainable Agriculture Working Group on Policy, and engaged a lobbyist whose name I have to mention. He's one of the unsung heroes of this whole effort. His name is Ferdinand Hefner. Ferd Hefner. We also owe so much to him and all the good work he continues to do, although he's getting close to a retirement too. And the fact that so many of us are in that age group led me to realize that we really needed to document a lot of the work that good folks like Mary and others have done. And so after I left McKnight, I got a position temporary with the University of Minnesota Sustainable Ag Institute, and I'm going around in what will be another, I think, a thing I'll be busy for a long time, going around doing video interviews with key people who have been involved in agricultural policy over the last 30 years. And in the course of that, of course, I talked to everybody about, well, what do you really think we got done? And still needs to be done. And I have to put this in the context of here. This work really was around the idea of problems in agriculture. For those of you familiar with New Roots for Agriculture, as Wes pointed out, there's the big problem of agriculture, which we aim to, which is all around solving this ultimately with polycultural perennials, but at the same time, we're pushing efforts to try to deal with the agriculture system we have right now. And fortunately, I'm feeling like one of the good things that happened is that dichotomy between the in agriculture problems and the of agriculture is closing somewhat, because a lot of the solutions that the policies that everybody's working on with the National Sustainable Ag Coalition are drawing on the precepts and inspiration of the work of the Land Institute. So I think that separation is shrinking. And but I'm in my remaining couple of minutes, I want to mention just a few of the policies that have passed that I think are so important. One of them is the Conservation Stewardship Program. That program was started in 2002 with a lot of work by a lot of people, and it's and the great thing about it, it's working lands. It's actually supporting farmers who are doing the right thing on the land. It's controversial because it's not necessarily taking on the biggest problems, but it's rewarding farmers who are doing the right thing and trying to make their farms better every year. It now happens to be the biggest conservation project in the country. 60 million acres are enrolled so far, and this year there'll be another 10 million acres enrolled. I'm not going to have time to hit some of the other ones I wanted to hit, but I also do want to finish up with one of them is called the Outreach and Assistance to Socially Disadvantaged and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers, a long title typical of Washington, D.C. But one of the things that's been accomplished in the last 30 years, not by the National Sustainable Ag Group, but by the Rural Advancement Fund, the Federation for Southern Cooperatives, the Rural Coalition, is that dealing with the injustice for hundreds of years actually, but at least in the 20th century, the fact that black farmers were not getting any support from the USDA that amounted to anything. And they took this on, and I'm happy to say there's still so much to do with it, but at least that's been dealt with. There was a class action suit that ultimately got $2 billion in reparations to deal with this. So these are the sort of things we're working on. The bigger picture of the structural problems in agriculture remain. Industrial agriculture still dominates. I don't know how long we can say we have a sustainable agriculture in an unsustainable world, but that's our big challenge. Thank you.
So hello, my name is Jeff Filipiak, and I don't have the long record of accomplishment in the movement that all of my esteemed panelists do. I'm up here because I'm trained as a historian. I decided to write my dissertation on the ideas of Wendell Berry and Wes Jackson, focusing on the period through 1987. You may be thinking now, I didn't realize historians often get invited by someone to their workplace to come and tell them what you think they did and what the importance of it is. You would be correct. We do not often do that. So I'm a bit anxious that both of my subjects are there and can come and tell me what I am saying wrong about them afterwards. On the other hand, it is very exciting to have a chance as a historian to come here and see the influence of one of your subjects in action right in front of you. So that's exciting to see all you guys out there. I have continued my research studying more in 1970s environmentalism, including John Denver. In my comments, David wanted me to sing, but I'm going to mostly focus my talk today on the first decade or so of the Land Institute. That's, again, what I covered in my research. I'm going to open by drawing attention to a couple key connections. The Land Institute has long got support from the broader environmental movement. It's been a key source of media coverage for it, environmental publications. It's gotten support from some major environmentalist groups. That said, with one key exception, those groups have tended not to actually support perennial polyculture research, the kind of research the Land Institute does, maybe more so to just spread the word about it. For the Land Institute's part and Wes Jackson's part, from the first Earth Day through recent Prairie Festivals and land reports, the Land Institute has steadily supported individuals and groups working on environmental issues and often quite distant from the specific perennial polyculture project. So although we focused on how the land in a lot of ways has become more of a professional scientific research institute, it still retains a lot of breadth as well. Also, while yesterday's talks, including that very convenient equation we had from the scientists explaining the influences on Wes, did highlight key strands, I want to remind us not to forget the contingency and the choice. It can seem easy sometimes to assume that things had to happen the way that they did. Different choices could have been made. The present incarnation Land Institute has enabled certain successes in certain ways, but others are going to have to take up work on some of the issues the Land Institute no longer devotes so much attention to. Maybe no one needs to work on the newspaper house, but there might be some other things to work on. So I'm going to now run through a bit of the chronology, as historians like to do. So going back to before the Land Institute begins, by 1968, Jackson had turned his introductory biology course into a Man and the Environment course. In 1971, he published the class readings under that title as one of the early environmental education texts. The Jacksons were a big part of Earth Day activism in Kansas. He went on to establish a survival studies program at Kansas Wesleyan and then an environmental studies program in California. We could also say part of Wes's vision for that included, as Angus noted, helping Angus identify himself as an environmental historian. So this is, they're strongly a part of the movement here. When they make their big leap, they move back to the land in 1974. They're exploring alternative, appropriate technology options. They're thinking a lot about Aldo Leopold. These are things a lot of environmentalists are doing in the 1970s, and they're very much a part of this. Then they decide to found an alternative school. When they did so, the reading list was very heavy on environmentalist and countercultural readings of the time. They were inspired by the popular Whole Earth catalog, by some of the work of David Orr on environmental education, the New Alchemy Institute, and newsletters from a lot of small organizations which may not have had much of a footprint lasting beyond the 70s, but were kind of an inspiration. Looking through this, the archival material, you can get a sense of some of the struggles that are going on, some of the work of heads and hands digging in the dirt it took to make these decisions. And when I say in the archives you can see the dirt, I've done a lot of archival research. This was the only collection where I looked through where the materials were fresh enough there actually was dirt in one of the boxes. So I have a feeling there's a metaphor there about the work of the Land Institute, but I have to leave that maybe to Wes to come up with that. When Jackson developed his perennial polyculture thesis, perhaps his most significant support came from the best-known American environmentalist leader at the time, probably, David Brower. Brower's group Friends of the Earth published the second article that Jackson published on that, revised version of the one in the Land Report. Brower suggested that Jackson should write a book on the topic, and then Brower's group published the first edition of that book, New Roots for Agriculture. For Wes's part, he'd supported that group Friends of the Earth since his time in California, and he later served on its board as well as on the board of carrying capacity. As the years have gone on, even again as the focus narrowed, you still have this breadth here. For instance, the work of Terry Evans, a photographer helping people understand the prairie and appreciate the prairie in a quite different way than the scientific work of the Land Institute does, but always seen as continually important, and someone else who Wes helped find direction and then has helped Wes find his direction. Donald Worster, the Dean of American Environmental Historians, has long served on the board of the Land Institute. It is a pretty impressive connections the Land Institute has to people working on environmental studies outside the sciences. And that's part of projects like Matfield Green have looked to explore things in some other ways. In the 1980s, the movement faced new challenges. Promoting sustainability through government became more difficult. Hopes for sweeping systemic change declined, and so we see a turn towards more individualistic private options. So a private research institution came to seem a better option. We also see, I think, the rise in sustainable agriculture of organic becoming the key concept around which a lot of people thought about sustainable agriculture, which of course has some complications in that. The Land Institute presents a different model. and so does the community-based agrarian vision of Wendell Berry, and which, again, Matfield Green was working to explore. So I want to quickly draw attention to a continual role by Rodale Press, published the most popular environmentalist periodical in the 1970s. This is a group that kept the ideas of J. Russell Smith and Albert Howard alive. Those ideas were an influence on the land. They studied perennial polyculture, as one of the speakers yesterday noted. They profiled Jackson in the 1980 article with one of their writers, Wendell Berry, coming out to write that piece. And so to close up, I think part of what's interesting about the Land Institute's position is there's not a lot of other organizations like this. You think about a sustainable agriculture group that isn't about producing food and doesn't have people acting out, but still provides a model that has inspired a lot of people, including Ron and, say, Seed Savers Exchange, to work on other related projects. Thank you.
Well, over the last couple of weeks, as I was thinking about serving on this panel, and our challenge was to show how the Land Institute had operated in the context of this much larger movement. And so I thought, well, what we ought to talk about then is the two cultures, because the Land Institute obviously is part of a new culture, and there's the old culture, which most of us are still operating in. And then yesterday, the former board members covered all of that. So then I decided that maybe the thing that would be most helpful to add to the conversation today is how do these changes come about? How do we change from one culture to another? And I think that a lot of us often still operate in the notion all we got to do is come up with a better narrative and get it out there and convince people that they should change the culture. But you know, one of my heroes who has influenced my thinking was Thomas Berry, who was a theologian, died a couple of years ago. And in one of his books, he made a very important point, I think, that has really impressed me. And he said, in his book, he said that we should always consider moments of crises as moments of grace, because most of us as humans never make the kinds of changes that we need to make until we feel the pain which drives us to those changes. And so then I got to thinking about that, and I thought, you know, we're going to have a lot of moments of grace in our future. And if you think about our current culture, which this industrial, which we call the industrial culture, absolutely operates on the basis of a continued belief that the resources which they use for all of the inputs that drive that culture are always going to be there. And I think we are now rapidly reaching a point where certainly everybody in this audience knows that that's simply not the case. And increasingly, we're all going to have these moments of grace when we're all going to realize that it isn't the case. Because all of these inputs are ultimately based on what Ernest Schuske called old calories, because they're not renewable. So there's fossil fuels, there's minerals, there's fossil water. You know the list of them all. And we are now reaching a point where those resources simply aren't going to be there, and so that industrial culture can't function anymore. And that's when the message that we have and the kind of work that the Land Institute is doing here and that other organizations we've just heard about have been doing, we become so important. Because when the old culture doesn't work anymore, when the old industry doesn't work anymore, then we're going to need to have not only the narratives, but the actual on-the-ground experiences and operations that help us to know the new direction that we need to move in. And that's where we need to be going now. Now, in that regard, I always try to look for some good news, because it's also important for us to maintain our hopefulness, and the hopefulness should be grounded not just in imaginary kinds of things, but in actual real experience. And one of the most recent publications that really inspired my hopefulness was John Takara's new book, which just came out last November, called How to Thrive in the Next Economy. And if you think about that, how to thrive in the next economy, and of course what he points out in this book is that this industrial economy increasingly is moving in a direction now it's no longer going to be possible. So what should the next economy look like? And then and this is the important part, based on his travels around the world, he discovered that a new economy is already emerging. And it's an economy, he borrowed the term, which I think first appeared in the literature back in the 1970s, bioregionalism, and we've used it some here at this conference. And what he points out is these bioregional economies, when you look at things around the world, are already emerging. And more in the developing world than in the developed world, because in the developing world, you know, the moments of grace are arriving faster than they are in the developed world. But even in the developed world, they're starting to happen. But these bioregional economies are places where people are coming together in their own ecological communities, their own ecological regions, looking at their own resources, and how can they use those resources in a new concept of growth, where growth is not about economic growth, growth is about the regeneration of life on Earth. And this is already happening all around the world. And so I think that the important lesson for us is, how do we prepare ourselves for how to live in a bioregional economy? And it's that going home that Wes likes to talk about, where we find our home in our own biological, our own ecological communities, and living in those communities in a way to regenerate life on Earth. Not only for ourselves and for our communities, but for our children and our grandchildren and all the other organisms of which, as Aldo Leopold reminded us, we are simply plain members and citizens. We're not the conquerors. And so this is the transition that we are going to be making, and certainly maybe not some of the old guys like me, but certainly our children, our grandchildren, and their grandchildren. This is the future that they're going to move in, and the hopefulness is that this can be a much better life than the life that we have. As we know now from psychological studies, we like to say this is the best quality of life we've ever had, and it's simply not true. Our rates of suicide are higher, our rates of depression are higher. You know, all the bad things are going up. And so we can have a better life, and that's what we look forward to. And this is the larger context that all of us here are about, and the future that we can look forward to.
Also, a round of applause for our timekeeper. I believe that the fate of civilization and sustainability depends on running meetings that end on time. And so, great job. Phenomenal panel. Thank you. And this is these are four of the heroes in the movement, but there are lots of you out here in the audience who are doing similar kinds of work. And so this is a crowd of heroes and heroines, and so applause to all of you. I want to add, and I don't need a timekeeper, by the way. This is all going to be about numbers, not poems. When the land was founded, I'm still cold. I've had 4 offers of coats, but the prices are too high so far. When the land was founded in 1976, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere was probably about 345 parts per million. And as all of you know, the background rate was about 280 parts per million. That was the historic level for most all of the past billion years, and make it back to 14 or 15 million years. We're now on the 40th anniversary of the Land Institute at about 402 parts per million, give or take. Mauna Loa recorded a reading of 417 parts per million briefly on one day 3 or 4 months ago. We were told, we thought, that when the first debates about climate change began to be made public, we were told that the guardrail for safety was something like 2 degrees centigrade warming, centigrade, not Fahrenheit. At the Paris conference, scientists requested and people responded, the delegations responded to cut it to 1.5 degrees centigrade warming. We're presently at about 1.2 degrees centigrade, and there's not anybody in this room that could give plausible reasons, as we typically think of those, why we'll stop at 1.5 degrees centigrade. We're on track for 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade warming, as Bill McKibben and others have pointed out so well. And in this debate about climate and policy and so forth, there are 2 curves. There is the Keeling curve, which is the record of carbon accumulating in the atmosphere. And that's that curve that goes up like this, that sawtooth curve that keeps going up, and that's the one that started when David Keeling went to Mauna Loa at 315 parts per million in 1958. Now we're at 402 and rising at the level of about 2.5 parts per million per year. And then there's that other curve. Think of these as 2 bookends to the rational debate. That other curve is the falling cost of photovoltaics, renewable energy, and efficiency. The clean energy economy, as Tom Steyer calls it, or the low carbon or zero carbon economy. Those are the 2 bookends. And the problem we have is that both of those curves are correct. But one is more basic than the other. The Keeling curve, that remorseless working of the big numbers of the planet. Many of you in the room have pointed out that carbon is kind of the summation. It's the summary of all the other things that ail us, and I think that that's true. It's a symptom of deeper flaws that rest in the culture, but so too are nuclear weapons and robotics and a good many other things. They're rooted in complex things where Western civilization took a wrong turn. Most of those things have been discussed here in this place at some depth and in great eloquence over the past 40 years. And for that conversation, we owe Wes and all the staff here a huge vote of gratitude. That conversation now must go on, and it goes on from here around the world. For our part in Oberlin, what we're doing in Oberlin is trying to take this little town of roughly 10,000 people and make it a model of sustainability, not the model, but a model with all the flaws that pertain thereunto. So the goal is to make a food system that supplies 70% of our food. We've opened a food hub in the city. We've got an energy policy that aims for going beyond carbon neutrality to carbon positivity. How's that for a word? You're just doing better than you have to do. We open in May the first entirely solar-powered hotel and conference center, I think in the United States. I believe that that's true. And that's in the part of the country where sunshine is a theory. And don't get me wrong, we've heard about it. We have pictures of it. But I think we need tangible accomplishments. We need to go from talk to do. And we need to take this conversation across into Main Street so that we're visual creatures, so that some 70%, it is said, of our sensory apparatus is in our eyes. So we tend to believe what we see. The reverse of that's also true, but that's a different story. So we need to make sustainability the default setting. It is the normal thing to do. It's the normal thing to eat local foods, organically raised. It's the normal thing to take care of people around you. Justice is the normal thing to do. And you have to work awfully hard to burn coal or to be unjust and so forth. Let me end this just by saying again that the conversation that has started here 40 years ago, and it built on earlier conversations, as Wendell has pointed out so well, that go back into the arts and humanities and our distant history as a species. Those old and ancient conversations, they've been brought to a fever pitch here. And we have ideas combined with science and the humanities. And for that, we owe Wes Jackson, who's driven this process, a huge vote of thanks. So I think applause is relevant here. If you all share that. Now, let me do something that's totally shameless. This is an advertisement. This is your commercial moment here. This is the first conference, the first major conference we'll hold in that solar-powered hotel and conference center. It's called After Fossil Fuels, The Next Economy. And this is the book I have that's just out. It's called Dangerous Years. It's available just now for $29.95. Copies are waiting back here. Actually, I'm kidding. This is so shameless. Wes is shaking his head in shame. Now, this is your moment. We've got, Wendell has surrendered his time. Wendell, we're grateful. This is...
Comes up with some data.
Data, yeah. Wait, Wendell, Gary Nabhan has said, if you can come up with some data and some numbers, we'll let you up here, but not another poem, Wendell. All right, how are we doing time-wise? It's 25 after. We got what? Yeah. Elaine just held up 4 fingers. I'm not sure what that meant. Elaine's my wife. Not sure what that meant. It could mean lots of things.
You scared Wendell out of the bar.
Boy, at last, it took a long time.
Nice work, David.
All right. All right, Con Nugent's going to sing a national anthem, and then we'll just... All right. Now we've got. Please stand up, identify yourself, and no comments. We've got enough of that here. But say who you are, offer a question, identify the person here that you want to answer.
For the purpose of time, they have to be multiple choice questions.
Mr. Nabhan says they have to be multiple choice questions. We're old up here, except for Jeff. We're old people up here. All right, over here. Name and then question.
I'm Nathaniel Batchelder from Oklahoma City. The platforms of the 2 major parties could not be more extreme with regards to the issues on the table today. And yet, there seems to be almost no news about it. There seem to be no questions about it. As if, as a lot of people believe, global warming, climate change is either not important or it's a hoax. So, what do we do about that?
Yeah, smarty.
He asked me to repeat the question. I'm not going to do that. It was all about politics. And how many Trump voters do we have here? Remain seated. Well, the question really is, what do we do about the division in between left and right now? And the issues that animate all of us here don't appear in the electoral season. So one of you 4 savants, take this on. I'm not going to touch it. Ron Kroese, start us off here.
Well, I don't really have a good answer for that, but I know that I'm thinking about like the 2018 Farm Bill, and I really think that if we're going to be able to make some more progress in this, we need to have an administration and a woman leader that will be strong on these issues. And if we get that, we'll also probably have a woman as the head of USDA. There's a good woman named Kathleen Merrigan out there. A lot of us would like to see in that position. So that's just a hope.
Is that depending on who we elect as president, we could have a lot more moments of grace. So.
I would say that I think some of the roots of this go back to the rise of conservatism in the 70s, and as I mentioned, in the 1980s, a lot of Reagan administration policies made these more difficult to achieve politically. I know there was a lot of hope with talk about the 50-year food bill and the rise of the food movement that this might rise onto the agenda. It doesn't seem to be happening at present. Things could change dramatically for the better or for the worse. Historians are well aware of that. So.
The work that Courtney White has done with moving people toward a radical center and getting people from all parties in all walks of life to work on collaborative conservation is some of the most important work in a time where this country is more divided than ever. Courtney White, who founded Kavira Coalition, the radical center concept of moving people toward collaboration again is the most important task we have as Americans right now.
We need one, or we have time for one or two more questions. Are we past time?
Sorry, David. Sorry.
Let's take, we're technically supposed to go to 9:35, so let's take one more question here. Is it 9:25? We're on our own time up here. Let's get one last question here. Right. I can't see up there. What? Okay, one question. Make it very quick.
A lot of the recent analysis, I'm Michael Houston from San Marcos, Texas. A lot of recent analyses are showing politics breaking down in a rural-urban divide, education being the primary driver. How do you see that feeding into a renewal of agricultural sustainability?
All right, real quickly.
I want to quickly plug a friend of mine's book. Kathy Kramer has a book on rural discontent in Wisconsin. Also want to suggest that I think right here we have perhaps the most impressive model of philosophical conservatism in Wendell Berry's book that could lead to hopefully some new potential.
So good enough? Thanks to all of you. Thanks to the panelists.